nation can be without talking about a key pillar of our democracy, the judiciary and the legal system, and to speak about the checks and balances needed to sustain our democracy in these transformative times is an esteemed panel of legal luminaries who I'd like to now call up. Mr. Mahesh Jethmalani enrolled at the bar in 1980. In the years that followed, he crafted his own track with numerous path-breaking and landmark cases to his name. On the screen, you can see the image of Mr. Jethmalani as a young lawyer. As a renowned senior advocate, he's on speed dial of many top leaders and corporations. He's also a parliamentarian in the Rajya Sabha, like his father, the late Ram Jethmalani, was. We've also got Mr. Aryama Sundaram, who began his journey in the field of law in Chennai in the early 80s. Here's an image of Mr. Sundaram as a budding lawyer. Today he's amongst the most sought-after senior advocates of the Supreme Court, known for his depth of knowledge and articulate delivery of legal opinions and arguments. We've got Mahesh Jethmalani and Aryama Sundaram up on this session on Drawing the Line, which is to be moderated by Executive Editor, Law and Governance, Rhythm Anand Bharadwaj. It's over to you, Rhythm.
Very good evening to everyone. Thanks, Rini, for that lovely introduction for my fantastic guests. And thanks for being a very delightful, engaging audience. I can see all of you making the right applauses and everything. It's wonderful to have you all here. Some words for the top lawyers that I have with me here today. Mr. Jethmalani, whom I've now worked with in the past 1 year, a very simple man, a very connected man, but very unassuming. Also somebody whom I've seen now does not like to speak outside the court, but inside the court, he roars like a lion. Mr. Sundaram, who's also on TV debates and people are gushing when he's speaking. I've seen the articulate way he speaks on air. He speaks about media rights very well. And of course, we have to say a lot about how both of them have one thing in common. They are fantastic to their staff. And this is something very rarely seen in senior advocates in the Supreme Court. It's an honor to be with both of them right here. My first question then, and I'll begin with you, Mr. Jethmalani, not because only you're in the government today. Yes. So this is a question on the same-sex marriage, something Arnab spoke to Smriti about. We've seen the central government tell the Supreme Court it's the parliament that needs to legislate. But we've also seen the Supreme Court being told by the petitioners it is their right to love and it is their time to come out. What are your personal views on this?
Look, I mean, one has to be a little careful because the matter is sub judice, and so one shouldn't overstep what one's going to say, particularly when the court is considering it, and there are people who've been arguing it, who've had much more in-depth reading and knowledge on the subject. But prima facie, I mean, I had a brief from both sides, and I was considering what to do, of course, and I found ultimately that this was an issue where heart and head collided. My heart was, to expand inclusion, give the LGBTQ community same marriage rights as the rest of the community. But when I got into reading this whole case, I realized that the judiciary had perhaps not thought it out well, because this is a stupendous task. Marriage is a whole set of rights and obligations. It's not just a solemnization ceremony. And it takes you into personal law. So I withdrew from this case altogether. And on the first day itself, I was not surprised when the Supreme Court said, we are not going to touch personal laws. If at all, we will give the LGBTQ community the right to marriage within the Special Marriage Act. Right. Now, that itself has a whole lot of problems. And I think, again, if you've been watching the proceedings, which I have from time to time, the court itself is balking at this whole exercise now. That can we fit this into even the Special Marriage Act? Just to take a couple of examples, just to give you 2 examples. The solemnization ceremony, which is Section 4, to get a little pedantic about this, Section 4 of the Special Marriage Act, right? That talks about the conditions of marriage. One of the conditions of marriage is that the husband and wife, that they should be, the male and the female should be parties to the marriage, right? So that what you find is, from the language of the Special Marriage Act, it is configured for a heterosexual marriage. Now, the word person is used, but the word man and woman is also used,
yes,
right? Now, if the word man and woman is used, we have a problem here, starting with the LGBTQ community itself. Right? What happens to the third sex? The third sex is intersex. Right? Basically, at birth, you are assigned either male or female sexes, right? But there is a third sex at birth as well. So it won't fit into that category. Equally, cross marriages between the LGBTQ community will also create a problem. So from the very start of the Special Marriage Act, you are going to have a problem on the question of solemnization. Okay. Then there are other problems, which, non-consummation voids the marriage. So an essential ingredient of marriage, even under the Special Marriage Act, for which any party can say my marriage has not been consummated, it renders the marriage void. Yes. The party can go to court. Now, what is consummation? We know what it is in heterosexual relationships. But what is consummation as far as the lesbian community is concerned? What is it as far as the gay community is concerned? The transgenders, the intersexuals, all these will have to be defined. In other words, right? This is a massive it's not an interpretation task. If it's a simple question of interpreting words in the Special Marriage Act, this could have been done. Okay. But it requires amendment, and it requires redefining a lot of words. That's a legislative task. Sorry. In other words, this is a matter exclusively meant for Parliament.
I feel I'm hearing the central government's affidavit now when you are talking, but I want to take that question to Sundaram sir also. And also another question that I wanted to ask you, so I'll ask this along with this. The collegium, lot of questions, controversy, sir, on the collegium. The law minister says it's opaque, a system. The vice president says it's compromising parliamentary sovereignty. And the Chief Justice of India says that if it's not there, then judges will not be insulated from outside influence. So on both these points, where do you stand, sir?
Well, let's understand firstly that like everything else grows, you just heard Mr. Hardeep Puri, you heard Smriti Irani, you heard Mr. Agarwal, all of them talking about growth and where it's going to lead. People should also understand that law also grows. Law changes, law transforms with a society. Law is not stagnant. And let me tell you what has happened. Whether one likes to see it or not, and this actually mixes both your questions together. Whether one sees it that way or not, the pervading influence of the judiciary is not something new. Firstly, in the Constitution, a provision was incorporated for whatsoever reason by our Constituent Assembly, by the Founding Fathers, an article you don't find anywhere else in any other constitution, anywhere in the world, written or unwritten, which is the law declared by the Supreme Court shall be the law of the land. Do you know how extreme that is? That is an antithesis of democracy. Literally an antithesis of democracy. The law declared by the Supreme Court shall be the law of the land. And the reason this was brought in was very simple. It was felt that the court will be declaratory of law. The court will not be making law. The court will declare law. So the law as declared by the court will be the law of the land. Things would have gone perfectly. Unfortunately, we had a dark period in our history called the emergency. During that, fundamental rights and other rights came to be abrogated and said to be non-judicial. So a very famous case, the case of Kesavananda Bharati, came up with a proposition that while Parliament is supreme, so far as legislation is concerned, Parliament can amend anything, even the Constitution, except the basic structure of the Constitution, and held that the judiciary is a basic structure of the Constitution. Why? Because democracy demands a balance of powers, separation of powers. You cannot combine king and church, neither of which, fortunately, are ruling in India right now. A country is ruled by the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Now, if that balance of powers is there, separation of powers, neither should step into the other. And therefore, Keshavananda Bharati protected judiciary, protected the basic structure of the constitution. Matters then went on, and there was no great controversy until the famous privacy case, the Puttasamy case, which in effect widened your fundamental rights. Look at it. Look how the courts have functioned. The court will not legislate. Only Parliament should legislate. If it's policy, court will not interfere. However, if the fundamental rights are involved, the court steps in. So how does the court expand its jurisdiction? You expand the fundamental rights. So the fundamental rights which existed originally in 1950 are different from the fundamental rights that exist today, because the right to life and liberty, which was understood as right to life and liberty, has become right to education, right to a clean environment, right to privacy. And that is why your same-sex marriage issue has arisen, because it was nothing but a successor. Once you said a person had a right to privacy, you allowed decriminalization of homosexuality. The moment you did that, the next step was, if your reason for decriminalization is that there is no difference between people who are in their private life living with the same sex as against those who live with the opposite sex, then the next thing is, why do you distinguish? If it's marriage, if it's anything. And so I think for the first time, as Mahesh, I don't always agree with him, but I must say here, but Mahesh has a point in saying there are a lot of other things to look at. And sometimes you have to see that the legislature and the judiciary have to go together. If one takes a march over the other, you will always have a problem. Now, where are you finding the other end? If you have the separation of powers, how can you have the executive deciding who their judges are? The whole purpose of the collegium system is that you have a body to preserve the independence of the judiciary without executive influence, because they are meant to be the check and balance against the executive. And then you say, by the way, you people who are meant to be the check and balance, you will be appointed by the executive with no say from the judiciary. It goes totally against the concept of separation of powers. Today, we're also quick to criticize the ED, the CBI, everybody else, even the chief election commissioner, as being under the control of the executive. Why? Because they're being appointed by the executive. So now what's your latest judgment? That the appointment of the chief election commissioner should come up with a totally different independent appointment mechanism. So the point is, appointments given only to the executive cannot be given when you have to check on the executive. So as far as this goes, I'll just conclude this part with a very simple statement rhythm. The foundation of separation of powers, of balance of powers, is that the executive and the judiciary should always clash. If the executive said yes to whatever the judiciary said, or judiciary said yes to whatever the executive said, then you were back to the days of Henry VIII, and when he got so angry with Cardinal Wolsey, because Wolsey had to say exactly what Henry VIII said, and the executive and the judiciary say the same thing. So who's the check and balance? So historically, for democracy, you will always find a clash between the two. And when you see these clashes, you sit back, look at the television, read your newspaper, laugh about it, enjoy it. And enjoy the lovely statements which are made by politicians, and the equally lovely statements which are made by judges.
Right.
Enjoy it, because that clash must continue for democracy.
Lovely. In fact, you spoke about how rights are changing since 1950. That's also the theme today, the theme of transformation. So we're seeing how this goes ahead. Mr. Jethmalani, I want to ask you a certain question. There is a certain pattern that has been seen in the near future by a very powerful coterie of lawyers and activists who start criticizing the judiciary. What's very shocking is sometimes they don't even have a rational critique of the judgment, and yet they criticize the judiciary. This is happening mostly in anti-India flavored cases. The Sai Baba case is one example where a lot of people spoke about the Bombay High Court judgment, and the Supreme Court set it aside, said the Bombay High Court will redecide it. But other than this judgment, there are certain people who continue to talk a certain way. I remember Kapil Sibal last year stating that the silence of the judiciary is something that he feels is something most vocal thing in the system today. And I remember you called it tendentious. I also see this year when the Atik case came, he lamented about the murder of democracy. Isn't this a dangerous trend?
Yes, it is an extremely dangerous trend, but I think when you're in opposition, and this seems to be right now a really oppositional feature, it's the way they cast the debate. Every time they lose, they blame it on, they first of all, they take misconceived cases to court. Cases which shouldn't have gone to court in the first place. Then they lose, and they then lament the loss of institutional integrity. So this is a trend which is, it's a disturbing trend. It's not a great trend. I've criticized Kapil in an article on the Sai Baba issue. But it's also, you also find an element of contradiction there. I mean, while on the one hand, he says that, we have no hope from the judiciary, when he argued the Maharashtra government case, the Constitution Bench, the Shinde versus Thackeray case, at that time he said, we come to this court, the hallowed, his concluding speech was, we come to this court with, great hope, etc. Yes. So, it's all these lines, you got to, if you're a political lawyer, right, you will fall into these contradictions and you will be unaware of them until somebody points it out. So, not to criticize Kapil, he's a great personal friend, right? And
I'm not only talking about him. There are so many lawyers.
I can just say this. When you go to court, you go with great hope. When things go your way, it's a fabulous court. When things go against you, it's a lousy court. So remember, I always say one thing. You can't please all 100%. At least one of those people are going back happy, the others unhappy. And that's the way all of us are in life. So we all hope when we go, we come back hopeless.
The sign of a good court is when nobody comes out satisfied.
That is a sign of a court which does not take a decision.
Okay, a very important question that we have to touch on with this panel that we have is judicial corruption and also the pendency of judges not being appointed. There are 40,000 million cases in the lower courts, 50,000 in the Supreme Court. Hundreds of judges' appointments are pending. How is this going to be solved? Mr.
You want to take that?
Both of you have to take
My answer is very simple. Here is Mahesh. He's wearing two hats. One as a legislator, the other as a lawyer. He cannot solve this problem as a lawyer. He can only solve it as a legislator. So please go ahead, Mahesh.
The buck stops here. All right. Well, look, there is no doubt that there is corruption in the judiciary, right? I mean, people are very squeamish about saying this. In the lower judiciary, it is. In the lower judiciary, it's pretty rampant. Equally, it does exist. It does exist, but we don't say it because we don't want to undermine the institution, right? The bad apples should not make you make that inductive leap to condemn the entire institution. So the only way to do it is judges on corruption. And this is, something I noticed in one of the parliamentary committees I was sitting on, the Law and Justice Committee. There we found that since 2011, judges were supposed to make a voluntary declaration under the Judicial Accountability Act of their assets. But since 2011, no judge has actually made that declaration. So it's about time somebody came and said, if you want to stop corruption, one of the measures of corruption is, where did you start off as a judge and where did you end? So please declare your assets at the time you step into that chair so that one can then measure your corruption. But this is not happening. Yes. And nobody at the bar really wants to say this. But the judges should voluntarily come and do this.
Well, Rhythm, I have a different take on corruption, if I can share it with all of you. The people in power, whether judiciary, whether politicians, whether bureaucrats, whether policemen, people in power are as corrupt as the people are. If people are intrinsically honest, the bureaucrats, the judges, everybody else will have to be honest. If they are dishonest, and if they've taken a bribe, it's because there's a bribe giver. I'll give you a very, very small example. Let's talk of our Aam Aadmi in India. He goes on his cycle. He doesn't have his light. He's stopped by the policeman who says, your fine is 50 rupees. He will take out 10 rupees, give it to the policeman and say, I'll give you 10 rupees, let me go. Basically, as Indians, the basic Indian does not see a problem in his daily dishonesty. He sees the problem in a big dishonesty of the politician, or in the judiciary, as Mahesh indicates, or elsewhere. He sees that as a problem because that problem is big in rupees anna spice, the dishonesty. But don't forget, every ocean comes from a drop of water, and every salt mine has its little grain of salt. So if the basic Indian objects to any kind of dishonesty, even amongst himself, you will find that can be contained. Yes. But as long as your Indian accepts dishonesty, and we've accepted dishonesty from the days of 351 BC, Chandragupta Maurya, at his time was Kautilya who wrote the Arthashastra, where at that time he'd suggested there should be a chief vigilance officer, the equivalent of a chief vigilance officer. He called it the king's spy. And the king's spy was, in 351 BC, to spy on corrupt ministers and corrupt income tax collectors. So, let's become honest as people,
Yes.
as every single citizen, and then you'll get the honesty.
All right. On that note,
I'll just say one last thing.
Sure, sir.
That there cannot be a corrupt judiciary without fixers in between. And unfortunately, in Delhi, there are a whole string of identifiable lawyer fixers. So the bar is equal to blame.
well, I agree with you, and none of us are naming anyone here, but I think it's time for transformation. I also think it's time, like Sir said, that we ourselves become honest to ensure that our judiciary is also. I thank both of these wonderful gentlemen for being with me on the panel today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jethmalani and Mr. Sundaram. Thank you, Rhythm. Ladies and gentlemen, we're really tight on time now, so we're moving quickly, and we've got the time for transformation. Our session is titled A Strong Opposition. In 2012, when as a 38-year-old he was sworn in as the youngest ever Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, he had already created history. We're soon going to have him up on stage, and we have a picture from that swearing-in ceremony on the screen. In the decade that followed, Akhilesh Yadav has carved himself out as one of the leading forces and leading faces of the opposition in the country today. He plays a key role as the leader of the opposition in the Uttar Pradesh Assembly, heading the second largest party in the Assembly. So without further ado,